And to talk a bit more about the legacy of the Maidan Revolution, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Olga Oliker. She is the Europe and Asia Programme Director at the International Crisis Group. Good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A decade on, I'm interested in whether you believe we can still see the Maidan Revolution as a success, given that it did pave way for the annexation of Crimea by Russia and arguably this latest invasion as well.
So I think the argument that it was the Maidan Revolution that caused the Russian annexation of Crimea, that caused the beginning of a war that is about to enter its 11th year, full-scale war, third year war overall, 11th year. I don't think that's the narrative I would go with, right? Russia made a decision to foment a war where there wasn't a conflict. Yes, there were street protests, but Yanukovych fled the country right before the parliament voted to depose him. He had reached an agreement and then he fled the country. This wasn't something that made war by any stretch of the imagination inevitable. It did very much change Ukraine's future. But a big part of what changed Ukraine's future was the Russian decision to annex Crimea and begin a war.
And we'll talk about what's happening at the moment in Ukraine in just a few minutes. But first of all, when we look back at Maidan, one of the big goals of that revolution was to tackle corruption in Ukraine. Is that still a major menace today?
Absolutely. I'm not sure there are many countries where it's not, but I think wartime Ukraine, as I think one of the folks interviewed in the previous segment pointed out, corruption during wartime, it's effectively treason, right? You're not just skimming something off the top. You are preventing your country from fighting effectively for its survival. And we've certainly seen evidence that there continue to be problems with this, that we are seeing that corruption continues in Ukraine. We're also seeing a lot of efforts to get it under control. And look, it's a hard thing to do. It's something that has been endemic in the system for decades, and not just in Ukraine. It's tied up with corruption in other countries. I think expecting it to have magically disappeared simply because a government changed, that's a bit too high a bar. But it is absolutely true that this is, if Ukraine is to be victorious, it's going to need to tackle corruption much more than it already has.
Can Ukraine be victorious, though? If I just put that question back to you, as you say, it will be 2 years on Saturday since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began. How's Ukraine doing on the battlefield right now?
This is not a terrific time for Ukraine on the battlefield. I think moods are about as dark as they were, well, 2 years ago in February of 2022, when we were all waiting for the Russian invasion. But there have been a lot of ups and downs since then. If Ukraine does not get the weapon supplies from the West that it needs to keep fighting, if it does not solve its problems with mobilization and get people into the ranks, then it does not stand much of a chance. If it does get the weapons and it does solve its personnel problems, well, look, I think the choice has become between a long war in which Ukraine gets these things and there are more backs and forths, or a short war in which Ukraine loses. But that will have tremendous knock-on effects and repercussions, not just in Ukraine, but for European and global security. So I think that's the point we are at now.
And on that question as to financial support for the Ukrainian army from Western allies, is it drying up at the moment? What are we seeing in Western capitals? Why is there this reticence to fund Ukraine at the moment?
So in the United States, where we've got the biggest problem, what we have is a small group of Republican lawmakers who have effectively held hostage the next tranche and presumably all future tranches of military assistance to Ukraine. So it's not that there isn't bipartisan support in the United States, it's that the US system has been structured in such a way that a small minority group of lawmakers can prevent the assistance from flowing. On the European side, Europeans just can't move as quickly to provide military assistance. They have been very effective in providing economic assistance, but getting the weapons factories running and producing weaponry, they've moved slower, in part because the United States has been able to move quickly. And if the US sort of disappears and leaves a gap, then the Europeans, in principle, have to step up. But again, this also isn't an instantaneous process, and this does cause a huge problem.
Olga Oliker from the International Crisis Group, it's been great to get your analysis. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.